Hi, boys and girls. It's Teacher Bill. I want to read to you another Dr. Seuss story. This is kind of a really long story, so get comfortable if you need to get a snack. This one's called The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. Alrighty, here we go. In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He had only one hat. It was an old one that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and the plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always pointed straight up in the air. You see the feather? The kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His palace stood high on top of the mountain. From his balcony, he looked down over the houses of all of his subjects, first over the spires of the noblemen's castles, then across the broad roofs of the rich man's mansions, and then over the little houses of the townfolk, to the huts of the farmers far off into the fields. It was a mighty view, and it made King Derwin feel mighty important. There's King Derwin looking over all those houses. Far off in the fields, on the edge of the cranberry bog, stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers to the houses of the townfolks, then to the rich man's mansions, and then the nobleman's castles, up to the great towering palace of the king. It was exactly the same view that Derwin saw from his balcony, but Bartholomew saw it backwards. It was a mighty view, but it made Bartholomew Cubbins feel mighty small. Just after sunrise one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for town. He felt very happy. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather in his hat. In his right hand, he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring money back home to his parents. He walked faster and faster till he got to the gates of the town. The sound of the silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats clattered on the cobblestone street. "Clear the way! Clear the way! Make way for the king!" Pretend you have a trumpet. Go like this. Do-do-do-do. Pretend the king is coming. All the people rushed for the sidewalk. They drove their carts right up over the curbstones. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. Around the corner dashed 50 trumpeters on yellow-robed horses. Behind them, on crimson horses, came the king's own guard. "Hats off to the king!" shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On came the king's carriage, white and gold and purple. It rumbled like thunder through the narrow street. It swept past Bartholomew. Then suddenly, its mighty brakes shrieked and lurched, and then it stopped. The whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe what he saw. Through the side window of the carriage, the king himself was staring straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. "Back up!" the king commanded the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guard shouted to the crimson horse robe. The trumpeter shouted to the yellow-robed horses. Very slowly, the whole procession backed down the street until the king's carriage stopped right in front of Bartholomew Cubbins. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew. "Well, well," he demanded. Bartholomew shook with fright. "I ought to say something," he thought to himself, but he could not think of anything to say. "Well," demanded the king again, "do you or do you not take off your hat before the king?" Yes, indeed, sire," answered Bartholomew, feeling greatly relieved. I do take my hat off before the king." "Then take it off this very instant," commanded the king, more loudly than before. But sire, my hat is off," answered Bartholomew. "Such impudence," shouted the king, shaking his angry finger. How dare you stand there and tell me your hat is off? I don't like to say you're wrong, sire, said Bartholomew very politely, but you can see my hat is off. And he showed the king the hat in his hand. If that's your hat in your hand, demanded the king, then what's on your head? On my head? Gasped Bartholomew. There did seem to be something on his head. He reached up his hand and touched his hat. Uh-oh. There's one in his hand, and now he has one on his head. The face of Bartholomew Cubbins turned very red. It's a hat, sire, he stammered, but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head. I don't care how it got there, said the king. You take it off. And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew quickly snatched off his hat. He stared at it in astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat, the same size, the same color, and it had exactly the same feather. By the crown of my feathers, roared the king, leaning again outside of his carriage. Did I or did I not command you to take off your hat? You did, sire. I took it off. I took it off twice. Nonsense. There is still a hat upon your head. Another hat? Again, Bartholomew reached his hand up and touched a hat. Come, what is the meaning of all this? Demanded the king, and his face was purple with rage. I don't know, sire, answered Bartholomew. It never happened to me before. The king was now shaking in such fury that the carriage rocked on its wheels, and the royal coachman could hardly sit in the seat. Arrest this impudent trickster, shouted the king to the captain of his own king's guards. We'll teach him to take his hat off. Uh-oh, now there's 3 of them. How many hats do you think he's going to end up with? The royal coachman cracked his long whip. The king's carriage swung forward up the streets towards the palace. But the captain of the king's own guards leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins up by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced off the cobblestones and rolled down into the gutter. With a jangling of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding road towards the palace. Out of the narrow streets, up the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher up the mountains, on past the walls of the noblemen's castles. Flub! A sharp wind whisked Bartholomew's hat. Flub, flub! 2 more flew off. Flub, flub, flub! Another flew, and then another one. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting the hats that were coming faster and faster. Lords and ladies stared out the windows of their turrets, wondering what the strange stream of hats could mean. Over the palace drawbridge they sped through the great gates and into the courtyards. The captain pulled his reins. His Majesty waits in the royal throne, said a guard, saluting the captain. The royal throne? The captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. I certainly hate to be in your shoes, he shrieked, shaking his head sadly. For a moment, Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king could not do anything dreadful to punish me because I really haven't done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight up ahead into the palace. Follow the black carpet, said the guard to the door. All through the long hallway, Bartholomew could hear the muttering of voices behind the heavy doors. He wouldn't take his hat off. No, he wouldn't take his hat off. Uh-oh. Do you think Bartholomew's going to get into trouble? Bartholomew walked on till, in the very middle of the throne, the king in a long scarlet robe was sitting in his throne. Beside him, Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. Lords and noblemen of the court, solemn and silent. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for the king? Your Majesty, said Bartholomew as politely as possible that he could. I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good. And then he took his hat off, and it didn't do any good. Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took hat off after hat after hat off until he was standing there in the middle of a great pile of hats. The lords and noblemen were so astonished they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. Heavens, said Sir Alaric, keeper of the records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. He's taken off 45. And there were 3 more down in the town, said the king. You must add on 87 more that blew off my head as we galloped up the hill, said Bartholomew, trying to be helpful. 135 hats! Most unusual. And Sir Alec was writing it down on his long scroll. Come, said the king impatiently. Sir Alaric, what do you make of all this nonsense? Very serious nonsense, the king said impatiently. Very serious, answered Sir Alaric. I advise you to call in an expert on hats. Excellent, agreed the king. Ho, guard! Fetch in Sir Snips, maker of the hats for all the fine lords. Into the throne room marched the smallest man wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. Take a look at this boy's hat, commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbins, and he sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. Your Majesty, sir, I, Sir Snippets, am the maker of all the hats for the fine lords. I make hats of cloth, of gold, fine silks, gems, and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this? Pooh! This is the most ordinary hat that I've ever laid my eyes on. In that case, said the king, it should be very simple for you to take off your hat. Simple indeed, mumbled Sir Snippets. Up on his tiptoes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. Immediately, another hat appeared on Bartholomew's head. Scribbies! Screamed Sir Snips, leaping high in the air than he was tall. He turned around, shrieking out of the throne room. Dear me, said the king, looking very puzzled. If Scripps can't do this, this must be more than an ordinary hat. 136, wrote Sir Alaric, wrinkling his brows. Your Majesty, I advise you to call in your wise men. I have a few ideas, said the king. Ho, guard, bring me Nod. Nod knows about everything in my kingdom. In came an old man. He looked at his hat on Bartholomew's head, and he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. Nod, my wise man, can you take off his hat? Asked the king. Nod shook his head solemnly. No. Then fetch me the father of Nod, commanded the king. He knows all about everything in the kingdom and in all the world beyond. In came an even older man, but when he looked at Bartholomew's hats, the father of Nod merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. Then bring me the father of Nod, ordered the king. He knows about everything in all of my kingdom, and all of the world beyond, and all the worlds beyond that may happen to be. Then came the oldest man of them all, but he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously at the end of his beard. Does this mean there is no one in the whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat? Bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. What's the matter? What's the matter? Uncle Derwin? To Bartholomew, it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped off the balcony and leaned over the marble railing. There's a boy in here, just about your age, the king said. He won't take off his hat. Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big lace collar, very proud little boy with his nose high in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wolfert, nephew of the king. "You send him down here," said Grand Duke Wolfert. "I'll fix him." The king thought for a minute. He pushed back his crown and scratched his head. "Well, maybe you can." "There's no harm in trying." "Take him to the Grand Duke Wolfert," commanded the king, and the two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. "Pooh!" said the Grand Duke Wolfert, looking at Bartholomew's hat and laughing meanly. "That won't come off. You stand over there." He pointed to a corner where the wall curved out. "I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow." When Bartholomew saw what the Grand Duke Wolfert had only a child's bow, he didn't feel very frightened. He spoke up proudly. "I can shoot with my father's big bow. My bow's plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours," answered Wolfert, and he let fly an arrow. Zoo! It grazed Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew over the parapet, but another hat appeared on his hat. Zip! Zip, zip! The arrows flew till the Grand Duke's whole bagful of arrows were gone, and still a hat sat upon Bartholomew's head. "It's not fair!" cried the Grand Duke. "It's not fair!" He threw down his bow and stamped upon it. 145 hats, gulped Sir Alarak. "These hats are driving me mad!" The king's voice rang out throughout all the palace. "Why waste my time with a child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all my realm. Fetch the yeoman of the bowmen." "Yeoman of the bowmen," echoed all the lords and all the noblemen of the court. A giant man strode across the terrace. His bow was as big as the branch of a tree. The arrow was twice as long as Bartholomew and thicker than his wrist. "Yeoman of the bowmen," said the king, "shoot off this boy's hat and make it stay off." Bartholomew was trembling so hard that he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow. Zrip! Like a mad giant hornet, the arrow tore right through the air towards Bartholomew Cubbins. Zrip! The sharp arrow hit a bit through the hat and carried it off his head for a full half mile. Grip! It plunked into a stop in the heart of an oak tree. Yet there on Bartholomew's head sat another hat. The face of the yeoman of the bowmen went white as the palace walls. "It's black magic!" he shrieked. "Black magic? That's just what it is," sighed the king with relief. "I should have thought of this before. That makes things simple. Back to the throne room. Call my magicians." In the whole throne room there wasn't a sound as loud as a breath, but from the spiral stairs led down from the southwest tower came the shuffling of slow padded feet. The magicians were coming. Low and slow, they were chanting words that were strange. "Dig a hole 5 furrows long, down to where the night snakes creep. Mix and mold the mystic mud, marble, bauble, twitter, tud." It came 7 black-gowned magicians. Beside each one stalked a lean black cat. They circled around Bartholomew Cubbins, muttering deep and mysterious sounds. "Stop this useless muttering," ordered the king. "I want a chant that will charm away this boy's hat." The magicians huddled over Bartholomew and chanted, "Winnicus, Benicus, Fadici clay, hats on this demon's head, fly far away. Howl, men, howl away, howl away, howl away. Yowl, cats, yowl away, yowl away, yowl away. Hat on this demon's head, steep away. Creep back, leap back away, gleep away, never come back." What do you think? Do you think that's going to work? "A mighty good chant," said the king, looking very pleased. "Are you sure it will work?" All the magicians nodded together. But, said the king, looking puzzled, there still seems to be a hat upon his head. How long will it take for the charm to work? Oh, be calm, sire. We have no fears, chanted the magicians. Our charm will work in about 10 short years. 10 years? Gasped the king. Away, fools, he shouted. Out of my sight. I can't wait 10 years to get rid of this hat. Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do? A dreadful thought, said the king, biting his lip, but I'm afraid I'll have to. Young man, he said to Bartholomew Cubbins, and then, pointing to a small door at the end of the room, march down those steps to the dungeon and tell the executioner to chop off his head. Bartholomew's heart sank into his boots, but he did as the king commanded. I must take off my hat, he said to himself as he started down the long black stairway. This is my last chance. One hat after another tore from his head. 156, 157, 158. It grew colder and damper. 217, 218, 219. Down, down, down. 231, 232, 233. It seemed to Bartholomew, who must be at the very heart of the mountain. Who's there? Said a voice from the blackness. Bartholomew turned to a corner and stepped into the dungeon. The executioner was whistling and singing in his axe idly because at the moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed to be a very pleasant man. The king says to chop off my head, said Bartholomew. Oh, I'd hate to, said the executioner, looking at him with a friendly smile. You seem like such a nice boy. Well, the king says you have to, said Bartholomew, so please get over with it. All right, sighed the executioner, but first you got to take off your hat. Why? Said Bartholomew. I don't know, said the executioner, but it's one of the rules. I can't execute anybody with his hat on. All right, said Bartholomew. The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. What's this? He gasped, blinking through his holes in his mask as another hat sat right on Bartholomew's head. He flipped off this one, and then another, and then another. Fiddlesticks, grunted the executioner, throwing his axe to the floor. I can't execute you at all. He shook his hand with Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. The king had been taking a nap on the throne. What are you doing back here? He said to Bartholomew, angry at being awakened. I'm sorry, your majesty, explained Bartholomew. My head can't come off with my hat on. It's against the rules. So it can't, said the king, leaning back wearily. How many hats does that make altogether? The executioner knocked off 13. I left 178 more on the dungeon steps, answered Bartholomew. 346 hats, mumbled Sir Alaric from behind his scroll. Uncle Derwin, yawned the Grand Duke Wolford. I suppose I'll have to do away with them. Send them up to the highest turret, and I, in person, will push them off. Wolford, I'm surprised at you, said the king, but I guess it's a good idea. So the king and the Grand Duke led Bartholomew Cubbins up to the highest turret. Up, 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 the turret stairs he climbed behind them. This is my very last chance, thought Bartholomew. He snatched off his hat. 347. He snatched off another. He pulled another and flung another from behind him. 398, 399. His arms ached from pulling off all of his hats, but still the hats came off. Bartholomew climbed on. 448, 449, 450, counted Sir Alaric, puffing up from the stairs behind him. Suddenly, Sir Alaric stopped. He looked. He took off his triangular spectacles and wiped them on his sleeve. And he looked again. The hats began to change. Hat 451 had, but not one, but two feathers. And 452 had three. And 453 had a little red jewel. Each new hat was fancier than the hat before. Your Majesty, cried Sir Alaric, but the king and the Grand Duke were way up where they couldn't hear. They had already reached the top of the highest turret. Bartholomew was following just behind. "Step out right here and get out from behind that wall," snapped Grand Duke Wolford. "I can't wait to push you off." But when Bartholomew stepped up on the wall, they gasped in amazement. He was wearing the most beautiful hat that they ever seen in the Kingdom of Did. It had a ruby larger than the king himself had ever owned. It had ostrich plumes and a cockatoo plumes and mockingbird plumes and paradise plumes. Besides such a hat, even king's crown seemed quite like nothing. The Grand Duke Wolford took a step forward. Bartholomew thought the end has come to him. "Wait!" shouted the king. He could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. "I won't wait," the Grand Duke talked back to the king. "I'm going to push him off now. That new big hat makes me madder than ever." And he flung his arms to push Bartholomew off. But the king was quicker than Wolford. He grabbed his hat by the back of the fine lace collar. "This will teach you," his king said sternly, "that Grand Dukes never talk back to the king." And he turned the Grand Duke Wolford over his knee and spanked him soundly right on the seat of his royal silk pants. "And now," smiled the king, lifting Bartholomew down from the wall, "it would be nice if you would sell me that wonderful hat." 498, 499, broke in the tired voice of Sir Alaric, who had just arrived at the top of the stairs. "And that," he pointed to the hat on Bartholomew's head, "that makes exactly 500. 500, exclaimed the king. "Will you sell it to me for 500 pieces of gold? I've never sold one before." The king's hands trembled with joy as he reached for the hat. Slowly, slowly, Bartholomew felt the weight of the great hat lifting from his head. He held his breath. Then suddenly he felt the cool evening breeze blow through his hair. His face broke into a happy smile. The head of Bartholomew Cubbins was bare. "Look, your majesty, look," he shouted to the king. "No, you look at me," answered the king, and he put the great hat right over his crown. Arm in arm, the king and Bartholomew went down to the courting room to count out the gold. Then the king sent Bartholomew home to his parents. No basket on his arm, no hat on his head, but with 500 pieces of gold in his bag. And the king commanded that the hat he had brought, and all the other hats too, be kept forever in a great crystal case by the side of his throne. But neither Bartholomew Cubbins, nor the King Derwin himself, nor anyone else in the kingdom of Did could ever explain how the strange thing had happened. They could only just say that it happened to happen and was not very likely ever to happen again. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story about Bartholomew and his 500 hats. Alrighty, I'll see you next time. Bye.